All right. Hello, everyone. Live from George Castro's basement. It is the Kubernetes community meeting. I'm your host, Jeffrey Sika. If someone could be a note taker, that would be awesome. Someone has dropped the link to the agenda in the Zoom chat, so go ahead and pick that up if you don't mind. I'd also like to remind everyone that we abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, and this meeting is being streamed and broadcasted onto YouTube, so please treat each other awesomely. Today we have Chuck Ha demoing the Kind Cluster API provider. After that will be the 1.16 released updates, and then we have two SIGs giving updates today, SIG Azure and then SIG Release. With that, Chuck, please take it away.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, there was actually a slight renaming of the project from when I signed up to now. Now it's a Cluster API provider Docker, because we're only building on top of what Kind is using right now, but it's Docker is the new infrastructure provider. But yeah, so to give a little bit of background about Cluster API, it's a project under the SIG cluster lifecycle. And the goals of Cluster API are to expose or create CRDs and controllers for objects that represent a Kubernetes cluster, so that you should be able to manage and create Kubernetes clusters using CRDs. And it's extensible enough where you can plug in different cloud provider pieces, because not all cloud providers are the same, as I'm sure everyone here knows. So making a cluster in AWS looks very different than making a cluster in GCP or Azure or vSphere. And so we've made Cluster API extensible enough to be able to plug in different backend infrastructure providers. And I was here last year at some point giving a demo on the AWS provider, but this time I'm doing a demo on the Docker provider, where instead of using a cloud provider, we're using a local machine and using Docker as the infrastructure provider. So the idea, the general architecture, let me share my screen first, and then I will show you a picture that might help. Probably not, but we'll see. So the way that it works is you need a Kubernetes cluster. So this bootstrapping machine, this is a Kubernetes cluster. You need this to use Cluster API, because that Kubernetes cluster is going to have the CRD definitions. It's going to have the Cluster API controllers running on it. So you can send cluster objects and machine objects, the two main objects that Cluster API exposes, to this bootstrap cluster, or this management cluster is what we call it. And that will read the cluster objects, the machine objects, figure out what kind of a cluster you're trying to make, call out to whatever provider you've described, and go build you a cluster. And it will create and give you a kubeconfig so you can interact with that cluster. But as I'm sure you can imagine, the iteration time on developing Cluster API, when you have to go talk to a cloud to build a cluster, it can get pretty slow. So in the process of building an upgrade tool for Cluster API, we ended up needing to test this locally just for faster developer iteration time. And so out of that spawned this Docker provider backend. So I will get right to the demo. I'm just going to start with a command, because this takes just a minute or so to spin up, but I'll tell you exactly what it's doing. So there's a binary called CapT Control, and it takes a command setup, and that will create your initial management cluster. So this is going to call into the Kind libraries, the awesome work that the folks over at Kind have been doing, and build a management cluster in the style of Kind. So it'll create a brand new cluster, and it will apply all of the CRDs and the controller to manage those CRDs. And this part takes just a second. But CapT Control is a binary that ships with the Docker provider. It is very analogous to the cluster CTL command that ships with just about every other provider, except because we're not actually interacting with the cloud, we don't need a lot of the complexities in cluster CTL. So I replaced that with CapT CTL to be a little bit more straightforward. Okay, so now I have a watch going on Docker, so we can see I've got two containers up and running. There's one here called the management control plane, and the management external load balancer. So the load balancer is the thing that sits in front of your control planes. This allows for multi-control plane clusters to be created. The management control plane doesn't technically need one, but right now it's every Kubernetes cluster in this world needs an external load balancer, because we don't know if you're going to be adding more control planes or not. So we're just going to have an external load balancer and one control plane node. And now this is just waiting for all the internal components to start up. So it's creating, inside this container is an entire Kubernetes cluster. It's got the API server, etcd, everything you need for Kubernetes. So that finished. It goes and it gets the latest CRDs. It applies them to the control plane. So now we've got these custom resource definitions, clusters, and machines, and some other things not super important. We won't be going over those. And then it creates the Docker provider controller manager, which is the thing that understands what to do with a machine object. So CapT Control also does some nice things like print out YAML for us. So CapT Control cluster space defaults, and that's terrible output. So we will pipe that to JQ so you can see what it's doing. And you can see here we've got a cluster object, and we stick it in the default namespace. Other providers provide a lot of information in the provider spec, and that's going to be unique to each provider. Docker, however, doesn't need anything because it's a very simple provider. So we can take that same, let me just get my environment set up, that one. So we can take that same cluster that we just saw, and we can pipe it to kube control apply, and we can create a cluster. So now if we watch our Docker, we can see we have a new my cluster external load balancer. So the cluster object is really just kind of an infrastructure placeholder. And the only infrastructure that's necessary for this provider is an external load balancer that will map to all of the control planes. So now that we have that, we can create something interesting. So we can create a control plane, keep it in the same namespace. We'll pipe that to JQ just to see what it looks like. So you can see we've got a machine, and it has the set control plane. So that tells cluster API that we want a control plane machine. So I can run that same command through kube control. And I get a machine. And if we watch Docker, it will show up here. So you can see we're using the kindest nodes. This is the work that that is pretty much impossible to do this without. So we're using the kindest node to create our Kubernetes nodes. So we have this up and running, this my machine. And if you check out the port mappings, you'll see that the load balancer maps properly. Or there's some internal configuration. Anyway, now we want to create some workers because we have a control plane. We don't have to do workers. We could do more control planes. It doesn't really matter. Same namespace, maybe change the name of it to my worker. And we create a worker. This might take a second because the control plane does have to spin up before anything else will happen. It's going to block until that's ready, but it looks like it's already ready. So we have a worker and a machine. So now we want to interact with our cluster. That's pretty much the minimum we need for our cluster. So I'm just going to hop over to this terminal. You know what? I need to get the secret. Great. So this is the secret. This will go get the secret where it stores the kube config. My fault. There we go. And then we can export kube config. My cluster. Great. And then we can. Okay, good. So you can see I've got my machine here, my worker here. That one's not ready for some reason. I will debug that in a second. But anyway, the cool part about this, and the thing that differentiates this from Kind, is that you can, in fact, modify your cluster after the fact. So I could go in now and create a new control plane. Name it my control plane 2 and my control plane 3, and it would just spin up those. It would spin up those control planes. So you'll just see after, as time passes, that these all do spin up and the cluster is sitting around running. You can make multiple clusters, and you can just delete the whole thing by cleaning your Docker, by just deleting all the Docker containers running on your host. So this has helped a lot for testing cluster API. And we have weekly meetings. Cluster API has weekly meetings on Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can find us in the Cluster API channel on Slack, and any involvement in any of the providers is always welcome, and we're always happy to help out. But that is the demo. I'd love to take questions if there are any. If not, that's great.
Do we have any questions? We do have a couple minutes for them.
So how can a guy can start his Spring-based application in microservice architecture? Do you have any reference document for that?
Could you? I didn't quite catch the middle part. Reference documentation for what?
For Spring's boot-based microservices. So suppose I want to host a microservices in the cluster-based Kubernetes cluster. So
Sure.
is there any document for that?
It's just a standard Kubernetes cluster. So if you're trying to host an application, it would be a kube control apply, assuming you have the correct kube config set.
Okay.
Yeah, these are actually just found out before this meeting started that these clusters do actually pass the Sonoboy conformance test or the Kubernetes conformance tests, which is pretty cool.
Any other questions?
No. Yeah.
All right, then moving on. Thank you, Chuck. That was an awesome demo. We now have the release updates for 1.16. I will change hats and now put on my release lead shadow hat because Lockie unfortunately couldn't make it. So July 16th, we released the Alpha 1 release. So the 1.16.0 Alpha 1 managed to get cut. It is not looking great as far as CI is concerned, but we're also very early in the release, and we know that, so we're moving towards fixing a lot of our CI signal. Big reminder, July 30th is enhancements freeze. So this is the point where if anyone is trying to actually lock in a certain feature in the 1.16 release, you need to get that in, and you also need to make sure that you have your CAP filed, or Stephen Augustus will follow you around and make mean faces at you. The only other big update this week is 1.15.1. So the .1 release for 1.15 released, I believe it is today. If that is,
it's happening now. Yep.
It is. Is it happening as we speak?
So the release has happened. Once the West Coast gets online, we'll be doing the debs and RPM cuts. So.
Excellent. And that is more or less where we're at as far as 1.16 and release team in general info. So unfortunately, due to OSCON, we have quite a bit of a drought as far as contributor tips of the week and KEPs of the week. So I wanted to get us right into the SIG updates. So first up, we have SIG Azure. Is that one going to be you, Stephen?
That is me, sharing my screen. And probably quitting Slack first. Yep. All right. So, hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Augustus. I am one of the SIG Azure chairs. I wanted to give a quick update and also note that on this slide deck, you'll see that it is the final SIG Azure update, and I'll go into that a little bit. So, quick overview on what we did last cycle. So we're continuing to work on our Azure out-of-tree provider. Things are moving well there. We're bolstering the testing as well as the documentation around some of that. There are some remaining things that we have to concern ourselves with: API throttling for in-tree, credentials provider, some of the storage related things for Azure File and Azure Disk that we need to look at to finally move out of tree. So I'm projecting 1.18 if everything goes well. So we have been contributing to the discussions on the SIG Cloud provider consolidation efforts. So the idea here, if you have not had a chance to see the proposal or the proposal that was presented, we basically got together on a Google Doc, as well as a few cloud provider meetings and the mailing list to discuss what it would look like to take all of the existing cloud provider SIGs and fold them under SIG Cloud Provider. That proposal has since been approved, both by all of the SIG chairs and by steering. So we're moving forward on that stuff. We have been so we've actually had the PR out this week, so thank you to Andrew Sai Kim to consolidate all of that stuff. So the initial administrivia of changing the sigs.yaml file and changing Slack channels over. So you'll see more details of that coming soon. I think we're internally just making sure we have all of our ducks in a row. What will be happening there is the current Azure sub-projects. SIG Azure itself will be folding under SIG Cloud Provider. The current Azure sub-projects will become sub-projects of SIG Cloud Provider as well. Right. So we're continuing work on Cluster API Azure. So if you were here for Chuck's demo just now, this is one of the multiple provider implementations of Cluster API. So you can check that out. And finally, we have a new SIG chair. So welcome to, in light of the recent news about us folding in, this will no longer be true. But welcome to Craig Peters. He is
shortest lived chair ever.
So he is an upstream open source program manager at Microsoft. So works with Locky, has been on the release team, is active in SIG PM as well. Really glad to have him on the team working to move forward some of the Azure sub-projects. So the plans for the upcoming cycles, 116 specifically, as always, we're going to be continuing work on getting our in-tree provider out of tree. So continuing with the docs and testing, that will remain in beta phase for 116. There are some dependencies that we have in tree for the Azure credential provider. So we'll be trying to decouple some of that and hopefully pull our provider specific implementation of credential provider out of tree. The Azure availability zones, so there is a CapT for this, which is under, we've moved that under SIG Cloud Provider at this point. So SIG Cloud Provider, Kubernetes enhancements, SIG Cloud Provider, Azure. You'll be able to find these CapTs. So Azure availability zones, we're moving to GA in 116. I think that the feedback has been generally good on that, so we're ready to do that. We're also doing the same for cross-resource group nodes. So being able to spin up a single Kubernetes cluster and have nodes that span multiple resource groups. We'll be moving to GA in 116. And on the cluster API side, we're working with the teams at Microsoft. When we did some planning over, I think immediately after KubeCon at Microsoft to talk about some of the efforts for the second half of the year. So one of the big things will be VMSS integration, so virtual machine scale sets within Cluster API Azure. So the idea here is that we are, there's an active proposal for that we're discussing with Cluster API overall. What we think will end up happening is an initial mock of what this can look like, the idea of bringing auto-scaling groups into Cluster API within the Cluster API Azure provider first. And what that will probably end up being is generalized so that we can fit that into whether it be ASGs or VMSS or MIGs, right? So figuring out a solution that will work for multiple cloud providers. So that's some of the work that will be happening 116. Better AZ support, I think we've already locked some of this in I think last month, and also beginning to work on the V1 Alpha 2 implementation for Cluster API Azure specifically. Right. So as I mentioned with the cloud provider consolidation, there are some, if you want to check out the PR, what's happening, it's over here, 3895 in the community repo. So there's some administrivia to be done, whether it be migrating the mailing lists, Zoom, Google Groups, and also spinning up the Azure user group, right? So the delineation between a sub-project, which is someone who, set of people who own code, versus a user group where we have a bunch of people who are interested in Azure in general, able to meet under the auspices of the Kubernetes community, right? So I think that, this may be one of the first times that we've done a consolidation like this for the community. So this is going to be a combination of figuring out what assets to move, as well as also walking through the steps for turning down a SIG, right? So there's going to be some overlap between what we do and don't do. So I think we're all discovering that as a group. So the things that we need from you, people who are interested in trying out Cluster API for Azure, please do. I'm one of the primary maintainers for that. I'm always curious to see more people get active there. Now that over the last few cycles, we moved it into an actual usable state. So please feel free to ask me questions either here or on the channel. We have a Cluster API Azure channel on Slack. And also feel free to shout questions in the Kubernetes SIG Azure mailing list. In addition to that, we're always looking for more contributors to the out-of-tree provider efforts. So if you're interested in that, please let me know and we can point you in the right directions. So where to find us? This will be less true soon once the consolidation is complete. But so the chairs again, myself at I'm a cloud native architect at VMware. Craig Peters, open source program manager at Microsoft. Cal is one of the principal software engineers at Microsoft, and Peng Fei is one of the I believe senior software engineer at Microsoft. So our homepage is Community SIG Azure. Slack, for now, you can see us at SIG Azure. That will be transitioning to provider Azure soon. And the mailing list is Kubernetes SIG Azure, and that will be transitioning to Kubernetes provider Azure soon. So thank you for your time, and I think that's all my slides.
Awesome. Sounds like there's a lot going on, and that's always a good thing to see. I believe next is SIG release.
There they are. So this is our SIG release update for July 2019. We last did an update, I believe it was in January. But since then, the last cycle, so over the 115 cycle, the release team did quite a bit of work, kind of ongoing sort of stuff. This is one of the main areas that we talk about in SIG release, but it's only a portion of what we do. So they're continuing to work on bringing more community members through the process. We've got a pretty well-established shadow process there to bring in new people. And what that does is give us a new set of eyes constantly to look at gaps in documentation automation, and folks have been doing cool stuff there. Two particular things to note from the prior cycle is the release team's test infrastructure role, which was mostly about some manual tasks for branch creation and test management. That has completely been automated away, so a big thank you to Catherine Barry on that. And then, as hopefully people have seen at this point, a new release notes website is out there. Thank you to Jeff on the call today for helping build that out, and the team of others within the release notes portion of the release team. So that's a really cool change, because we've had a lot of feedback from folks that the changelog is this 60-page document that's impossible to read, and no matter which way we slice and dice it and try and bin it, it doesn't give people exactly what they want, which is something custom. So we're doing a better job, hopefully, of summarizing the top level things into that static document that goes into Git, but giving a dynamic document that's searchable however you individually want to look at it. So the link is there. One other thing that happened in the last cycle, we had a late-breaking issue around scalability that threatened to derail the release, and thank you to everybody who dove in and held that to only a slight release, and I'll talk briefly about that more in a moment. We've been growing our patch release team, which in the past, for folks who weren't aware, every trailing release that had support, so like right now, 115, 14, and 13 are under support. There was a single individual for 9 months who ran that branch, managed its content, managed getting the builds out on something for a schedule. And we worried that that wasn't sustainable. So we've been growing that into a team and getting a better documented process around how that team collaborates on the content for the branches, produces the builds, and gets them out again on hopefully a predictable schedule for our community. And then we kicked off our release engineering sub-project. So next, Steven. In the upcoming cycle, we're going to be doing a bunch around that release engineering sub-project. This is in conjunction with the working group Kate's infrastructure, and it's about really reworking our release tooling to be more sustainable, maintainable, automated, and community-based. A lot of the core of these things are historical infrastructure and automation that had been set up by Google, and we're bridging that out into CNCF and working on improving aspects of that. One of the first things there is doing an audit of what we actually published today, and there's a link in the document there if you're curious. A key deliverable is going to be getting cleaned up package repositories. Right now, the way we do RPMs and debs is it breaks our users, and we need to do better and split it out into something much more correct. And what that'll give us is alpha, beta, RC releases that are actually consumable from a RPM or deb standpoint, or Cube ADM, for example. Also in the upcoming cycle, release team is going to continue to work on improving the release process. We've got things around our better establishing what it is for a release blocking criteria, documenting, advertising that, making sure it's reflected in our test grid dashboard layouts. Our branch manager role has shifted into a release managers team, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. And kind of an outcome of the scalability issue that we saw is we've had some meetings with SIG Scalability now and conversations about how we can more tightly interlock and avoid these issues, hopefully just through more proactive conversation and discussion, earlier heads up that there might be something brewing for an issue, because the scale tests take a long time to run and are complex to debug when they fail.
So yeah, I think that we've already made some nice progress with that. We met with Scalability last week and kind of walked through some immediate action items, making sure that they're in milestone maintainers, making sure that they're aware of the release cycle schedule, things like that, as well as Tim was mentioning, firming up this release blocking criteria and what it means to be release informing. So I sent an email summarizing some of that stuff as well as the meeting notes to Kubernetes Dev, so you can go ahead and check that out. Also, one of the things that we noticed is that some of the failing tests are not actively owned. So this is like kind of a tangential thing that we found as a result of having this discussion with Scalability. And we will be moving things that are currently in informing or blocking that are not owned out into a new SIG release orphaned jobs board, right? So you can still view them for a time and hope that someone decides to claim ownership over them before we decide to remove them.
So how this affects you. We've got a brainstorming document where we're trying to collect what it is we're looking to do there, and that's sort of ahead of a newer, better KEP describing what we want for a release process and getting it towards an implementable state. But as mentioned, better repository layouts for the RPMs and debs, adding artifacts, so getting packages for alpha, beta, RCs, so those are usable. Probably removing some artifacts. There's a number of things that are a little odd in there where we're like, why is it this way? And there, one of the things that we discover is a lot of this stuff is just there for reasons, but then also as we try to clean it up, we run into other reasons they're there, and we have to do this relatively deliberately and safely so we don't just break things. And a really nice final piece of this will be the artifact signing and the final step of publication today, which is a Google-owned process that will become a community-owned process.
So yeah, so within each of these steps, we kind of break out into the ideas of hosting, of artifacts management, of the build and release and test kind of life cycle of release engineering and for the project overall. So what we want to do is kind of tie all these threads together in an OmniCap, right? So this OmniCap is going to reference what our expectation of the state of releasing Kubernetes, I guess we can, are we calling it the Kubernetes distribution yet, Tim? Maybe not. But tying these threads together and then linking out to the individual KEPs. So we have KEP links a little further in our presentation that will show you our talks about artifact generation as well as management, image promotion, different things like that.
So how these affect you as we start making those changes to the publication process. We'd love to get folks involved in trialing using those and letting us know how it works, and we can iterate on that and do so deliberately so that we're not destroying the existing process upon which people depend on, and stand up something next to it and hopefully better over time. As always, we really need folks to give attention to CI signal, keep working on deflaking tests. As Stephen mentioned, making sure that tests have ownerships, that somebody's there to get notified of a failure and that the failures are acted on promptly. We really, for the release team, need tests to stay green. And then also be mindful of the schedule. We're starting the 116 cycle, so there's a link to the schedule dates, and they were mentioned earlier in this call, and I'm going to mention them again in 2 more slides. So it's important that we have people aware of the schedule and not getting caught short. The 115 cycle was very tight, and the schedule was hard, and this will be a more normal cycle, but it's something that all of these dates creep up on people.
So just to pop back over to the keeping tests green thing, and I want to like just hone in on the importance of this. Our tooling, actually the first thing that we do when we stage a release is there are a set of functions in our tooling that will look for a green build, right? It will look for the dashboard. It will look for a dashboard that has the first green build, and it will try to choose that, right? So when we have no green builds, the initial version of us staging a release will fail. This is why that's so important to keep those tests green. So I'm not sure that everyone had that context before, but that is part of it.
The other piece of context that people don't see either is that almost always, for almost every single release, we have to manually override that because we haven't gotten that sufficient level of greenness yet. So we need to keep working on getting there. So our various sub-projects, just to mention each of them, we've got a number of smaller ones. Licensing, this is a great place for somebody who's maybe a license or scanning or automation nerd to get involved contributing, but there's ongoing work there that falls under the auspices of our SIG, as well as the publishing bot. And it's another one of these areas where we have a small set of people doing a lot of work to keep something that's been around for a long time and is fragile and works, except when it doesn't, keeping it alive. So a huge shout out, first of all, to the people there in the owner's file. I link them just because the set of people there, the work they do to keep that running. And then also it's an opportunity for others to get involved. So the big team subproject that we always are talking about, release. This is basically stuff that I've already spoken to or that was spoken to earlier in the meeting more generally, and just the normal weekly update on the dates, but just once more so it's there in front of your eyes. The end of this month, enhancements freeze, code freeze coming at the end of August, and our target release is mid-September. As always, we keep very detailed information on all of the dates within those and all of the processes in the README for the release that is linked there.
So something that I realized we didn't put on the slides, but I really wanted to shout out in terms of building the release team this time around. Over the last few cycles, we have introduced a role called the Emeritus Advisor to the release team, right? So the Emeritus Advisor is a former release team member that is responsible for doing some of the work that provides this a continuous idea of a sub project or the release team as a sub project, right? So some of that stuff includes, facilitating some of the release team selection. Making sure that surveys are conducted for exit surveys for the outgoing release team, as well as just opportunities for improvement. So big hat tip to Josh Burkus for taking this on for the last few cycles. I have joined Josh for 116, so we've been working on building out the shadow team, conducting interviews along with the role leads, and one really curious fact is that we have over I believe we have participants from over 5 continents on the release team, and some rough numbers in terms of diversity is that we're looking at a team that is about 46% either non-white male or underrepresented groups. So this is something that we specifically focused on in shadow selection, and it's something that we continue to do. We want to see Kubernetes be this global community. We want to this opportunity for contribution within Kubernetes. We want to make sure that everyone feels that they can contribute in this way. So hat tip to everyone who is involved in that. The release team lead, Lockie, the shadows, Josh, and everyone who, all of the role leads for conducting interviews with that in mind. So I am going to talk a little bit about the release managers group. And, so Tim hinted at a lot of this before. So what we decided to do last cycle, and it was kind of a late change in the cycle, was pull the branch manager's role out of the release team, right? So what we saw is, as Tim mentioned, the patch release team, or the patch release manager initially, and I think that was maybe 3-4 cycles back that we still had a patch release, just a single manager. But one of the first steps that we did here is create a team around patch release, right? So now it's very interesting to see. We have a Slack channel, release management. It's very interesting to see that we kind of have this, like, it's almost a follow the sun situation happening. If we start off a release, we may see Peng Fei pick it up from Shanghai, and then it may end up at with Hannes, who is I think based in London, and I may touch something on the U.S. Eastern side, and then it may shift over to U.S. Pacific. So I think it's really interesting to see how we've gone from like a single person who can handle this for the span of a cycle over into a team that can kind of carry the ball forward if we run into issues, or if someone needs a break, right? So we wanted to do something similar with the patch release with the branch managers by pulling them out of the release team and more closely aligning them with the idea of release engineering for Kubernetes, right? So this is part of the reason for this is getting to a place where we can actually have a team that is aligned on a specific effort, where that effort being paying down the technical debt that we've accrued over the last few years in Kubernetes, in terms of like, how do we build, test, release, all of this, all of the things that Tim was talking about a little earlier, right? So the branch manager shadows, the former branch manager shadows of the release team have transitioned over to a release manager's associates role, right? So normally we take in about 3 to 4 shadows for each release team role. We decided with this group that it would be nice to build a very large team to be able to drive down some of these some of this tech debt, right? So we pulled of the I believe it's somewhere between 22 and 28 of the people who applied for branch manager shadow this time. We pulled in 13 of them for the release manager's associates role, right? So the idea is that moving forward, we want a team that is kind of a sister org to the product security committee, right? So the and the reason for that is, one, we want to essentially stand on the shoulders of giants, make sure that we're adopting some of the processes that they've already developed to move people through their contributor ladder, right? So find a way to, often someone will participate on the release team and move from shadow to a role lead, and then maybe question mark afterwards, right? But we want to see release manager associate become a branch manager, become a patch release team member, right? We want to build that contributor ladder and encourage people to stay around because we're kind of giving them the keys to the kingdom, right? Of these roles, the patch release team is responsible for cutting patch releases of Kubernetes, right? The branch managers are responsible for all of the things that go into, one, maintaining the branches, for maintaining the release branches, and the associated test infra and CI signal bits for that, as well as cutting a Kubernetes minor release, right? The release manager associates are people who will essentially be shadowing the branch managers, as well as being mentored by both the branch managers and the patch release team. Build admins are, as Tim mentioned, there are certain buttons that we cannot push. There's certain buttons that can only be pushed by Googlers right now. So the build admins is a set of, so we noticed in the documentation, there were lots of places where it said either ping Caleb or ping Sumi on Slack, and we said we want this to be a process that happens in the open. So now you can either ping the build admins, which are Alexandra, Sumi, and Linus at Google, either there or on the Kubernetes release managers Google group, right? And get a response in terms of building devs and RPMs for the project, right? And then finally, the Sig chairs. So Sig chairs, as we have ownership of all of the assets that are involved in release engineering, it is also a requirement that we, one, be a part of this release engineering process, as well as make sure that we're abiding to the security embargo policies that are put forth by the Product Security Committee. So that's essentially the idea that we're going to move forward on with the release managers group for starting in 1.16. That work has already started. We've already actually started, 1.15, we did a 1.15, we did a cut of the, I think we did a live release of one of the 1.15 betas maybe. And this week, we also did a cut of 1.16 alpha 1, which I sent in the announcement. We also recorded that. So there's part 1 and part 2 in the 1.16.0 alpha 1 announcement. So you can check out exactly how we release Kubernetes if you want to. So, as we described, lots of work to happen in this area, and I think the summary of that is the bash fire emoji, right? We have there are a lot of things that we've written in bash. Anago, one of our primary release tools, is 1819 lines of bash, right? And that loops into a bunch of other bash libraries that call GitHub and other release functions, right? So we want to get to a point where we're starting to consolidate some of the functions that happen in there, write them, be able to rewrite them in Go, and eventually destroy all of the bash that is around, right? So if you want a fun, if you want to check out a fun issue of all of the things that can go wrong with when you make changes to bash, feel free to check out Kubernetes release 8.16. I do some analysis of the test jobs, of the things that fail in master blocking and the reasons for them. That's still active analysis going on, but it's definitely a fun issue. I had a lot of fun trying to debug some of this stuff or understanding things that I didn't before. Tim, you want to?
I think we already covered this for the most part. As we'd mentioned, there'd previously been a set of KEPs around different aspects of the staging of build through release and publication, and we're looking to unify those, so coming soon. And a couple related things. So the standard template has us mentioning working groups. So Sigrist is one of the sponsors of the long-term support working group that's looking at what it is we do for our support stance in the project and whether there's ways to improve on that. So, and I would kind of defer to that, but there's a link to their SIG information. There are a couple things going on over the last quarter, is that a few proposal documents have bubbled up on what it might look like were we to do a different type of support flow. And those are out there for conversation and discussion and thinking. There was also a survey where we got quite a few hundred users.
500 something.
Yeah. We got a really good spread of responses back, and we've been trying to collate and statistically kind of analyze and bin and figure out what statements we can make from the community in terms of what was expressed for support desires. And then that also is going to feed back into those proposal documents. And then maybe less LTS working group specific, but there has been a project-wide emphasis that's ramping, I feel like, around promotion of key APIs to V1 stable and also improving conformance. Just want to mention that there because that's critical work and ties into how we release a quality product or project. And then not related to SIG release directly, but the working group around Kate's infrastructure is something especially that our release engineering subproject is working with closely. And that stuff is really starting to get some momentum, I feel like, over the last month or so. So that's a really positive thing. How you can contribute, we've mentioned release engineering repeatedly. Join our SIG release meetings to catch the ongoing discussions of that stuff, and also the working group Kate's Infra Slack channel discussions go on there. Licensing, as mentioned, Nikita is the place to reach out And our release teams are always looking for new and experienced collaborators. And we have the shadow process that is really designed to bring in and lift up and help people learn about the project more broadly and find areas to increase their contributions. We've obviously just started the 116 cycle, so its members are set, but we're only 2 months away from the next one starting. So if you're interested in doing that, feel free to lurk around the 116 release, pay attention to what's going on, how it's happening. And if you're interested, you see opportunity, then when the release team opens up for 117, throw your name in the hat. We would love to have more folks.
So just going back to licensing really quickly. So licensing, the current sub-project owners for licensing are Nikita, Dims, myself, and Steve Winslow at the Linux Foundation. So I talked with Nikita, and I appreciate, and I just want to shout her out vocally on the community call for, I basically said, you know, a lot of things are happening right now, and I need to step back and focus primarily on the release engineering efforts, because I think that that's probably one of the bigger impact things in the project right now. And I asked her to step up as the primary sub-project owner for licensing. So thank you, Nikita, for doing that. All right, so how to find
Standard
us.
places to find us. Yep, we have chairs. We're named there. We've got a page and community like everybody else for README. We've got our charter out there. We've got a Slack channel. We've got a mailing list. We have biweekly meetings. The minutes and agendas are linked off of our homepage there, and everything gets uploaded to YouTube. So like everybody, we've got all our artifacts out there so you can see what we're up to and hopefully get involved.
Thank you, everyone, for the time.
Thank you for the awesome updates. I realized that was a bit of a longer one, but I also knew you had a lot to talk about, and we had a little bit of time.
Thank you.
Yeah. With that, we have reached the end of our agenda. If anyone has anything they want to talk about for the next few minutes, we have open mic. Going once, going twice. I give everyone 13 minutes of their life back. Thank you for coming. Hope it was enlightening and awesome. And everyone, happy Thursday. Keep on being awesome people.